What's the difference between this sign and this? This sign is from 1937. It was at the entrance to German towns and it reads, "No entrance for Jews." Fast forward 80 years and just yesterday this was found daubed in a playground in Woodside Park. In a park where we perform Tashlich, a park where we have our Shavuot party. 80 years. But anti-Semitism is, as we've mentioned many times, the world's oldest hatred, and therefore it shouldn't surprise us. It's just one of many of the wrongs that we find in our society. There's ill health, there's poverty, there's discrimination. We may wonder why it is that the righteous seem to suffer, and why is it that the wicked seem to prosper. There are so many things that are wrong. When we consider the period of time that we are in, the 9 days leading up to the destruction of the temple, we bemoan and we mourn all the tragedies that we are suffering in our society as part of the Jewish people. And yet we are told never to cry over spilt milk. What's the point in living in the past? And yet year after year we find ourselves sitting on the floor mourning over bricks and mortar, over the destruction of the two temples. After all, we now have the state of Israel. We have a start-up nation. We've built an oasis in a desert. Why is it that the start-up nation can't start up again with a new temple? So let me share with you a little story. The story is well documented in Torah Sa'ola by the Ramah, and he says as follows. It was in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. And Jeremiah, the great prophet, an incredibly wise man and a prophet, found himself sitting on the floor surrounded by the rubble from the destruction of the temple, crying his eyes out over what had befallen the Jewish people. All of a sudden, Plato, one of the great philosophers, arrives accompanied by Nebuchadnezzar. And Plato cannot get his head and understand why it is that this great prophet, this wise man Jeremiah, is sitting and crying over bricks and mortar. So he says to him, I don't get it. It doesn't befit such a great person to mourn, to be crying over the destruction of a physical structure. And secondly, he says to him, why is it that you are crying over the past? What good is it going to do? So Jeremiah turned to him and said to Plato, have you ever had any questions, any real great philosophical questions that you grappled with and that you have not been able to solve, not be able to come up with solutions and answers? So Plato thought for a moment, and then he said, yes, I have 3 such questions that I have had over the course of my lifetime. So Jeremiah says, fire away. Tell me the questions. Tell me the conundrums, the problems that you've had. And Plato presents to Jeremiah the prophet his great philosophical thoughts and the things that have troubled him about the world. In one instance, Jeremiah was able to answer all of Plato's great questions that had puzzled and he'd struggled with throughout his life. Jeremiah turns to Plato and he says to him, you know where the answers for those questions came from? It came from what used to be in that pile of rubble. In other words, the divine presence. With that, Plato reportedly sat down next to the prophet Jeremiah and they both wept. When it comes to the destruction of the temple, when it comes to Tisha B'Av, it's not merely a mourning over the past. It's not merely crying out over the losses, the tragedies, the persecution, the subjugation, be it through the pogroms, Tach V'Tat, the Crusades, Holocaust, destruction of the temples, but it's something far more purposeful and meaning. The idea of the crying is that through recognizing what we have lost, what we are missing, then that is the building blocks for us to be able to rebuild the temple and bring and usher in an end to this exile. And that is why famously Napoleon Bonaparte, when he went past the shuls and he heard on the night of Tisha B'Av people crying and crying, and he sent his messenger in, one of his soldiers in, to go and look and to discover what was going on with the Jews. And they came out saying they were crying over a temple that had been destroyed 2,000 years ago. He said, a nation that cries like that, one day will be able to rebuild that temple. And so it is that all the things that are wrong in the world, that we are struggling with and we find so difficult to live with, all of them come from the source of that disconnect between us and the Almighty. There is a greater distance. Things aren't quite the way they should be. But if we are able to mourn and to recognize what we need to do to rebuild the temple, that, please God, will be the stepping stones to an end to the exile, peace in our time, and it will change Tisha B'Av from a day of mourning to a day of joy. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom. We look forward to seeing those that are able to come to Shul and have registered this Shabbat. Very exciting. And we look forward to, please God, one day, us very soon being in a rebuilt Jerusalem. Amen.